Okay, so third premise here is rhythmic division. So here, when you're playing a part from a chord sheet, what we're thinking about here is how you choose to effectively divide up the beats when you're playing. You tend to learn when you're playing music to feel the kind of fundamental rhythm of the song and the context of the feel of the parts, and then when we play, sort of instinctively infer how small or wide those rhythmic divisions should be. This is obviously the correct way to kind of feel things, and is a great starting point. But there's a lot of options to be had and effects to be deployed by making conscious choices about how dense or how widely spread the rhythm we are. In terms of if we're thinking rhythm and beat, everything tends to be divided into halves. So the delayed tails, my bar, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1. That's your halves, and then fours going that side. What we're going to look at is firstly density of. Not to be confused with density from the previous one. As I say that, I realised that was highly confusing. How full your part is in terms of its rhythmic impetus. So if that's your part, a part that's in fours is going to be more spaced out than a part that's in eights, using the American term, so we don't have to worry about the Italian, which I'm a big fan of. It helps to have sort of conscious decisions about how thin or sort of dense your parts are in terms of the rhythmic use, and it sort of comes back to a similar idea when we were talking about space, just on a kind of micro scale rather than an overarching phrases and the kind of band, like in a bar by bar case. So there's a lot of mileage to be had from approaching leaving space. So if we take our example progression, you could leave out every other chord change to create a phrase. I'm going to use these same kind of lower position chord shapes just for the sake of example. So there's your bar. So we could give it, if we're going to just pick a couple of notes from the arpeggio, 3, 4, leaving the phrase out, then we've got the E minor, 3, 4, leaving the C out. So already, leaving the C out, you're starting to create, I'm not using anything there that isn't already in those shapes, just picking a couple of notes, but by leaving that spare bar, you're starting to create a figure and a phrase. By the same choice, if you wanted it to be more movement, you could fill in that second bar. As you see, E minor, back to G. Immediately you've got two kind of different phrases, as you want to build intensity in the song. For example, leading into the chorus, say that's a verse progression. Your first half you can leave those bars empty, second half you can put it in, and you immediately start to get a part that feels like it's following and enhancing the flow and the shape of the song and the shape of the band you're playing with. You can also do the same thing by leaving rhythmic space. So rather than leaving a whole bar, for example, we could just give it, if we use that idea again, like so, which getting myself lost in my own progression. You can then increase the density. So to when we start to look at building, say, into the chorus, let's go E minor. So let's give it like so, and you're starting to create smaller subdivisions. Gives it a feeling of pace. So you can add and reduce pace by playing a part which is in two parts. Then as we increase it, you get that feeling of pace increasing, and you can do that in reverse. So it's worth kind of feeling the shape and dynamic of the song and of what the band are doing around you, and you can adapt your rhythmic division in the way you're picking parts and the way you're playing parts to kind of mirror those overall feelings. And so whilst mirroring the pace of the song, you can also create some contrast. A nice thing that's quite interesting, you hear quite a lot, is when you've got like half-time sections or a sudden change in feel. Sometimes you get instruments that actually go the opposite way. A classic one being you go into, say, a half-time bridge, and the guitar part is actually goes into smaller subdivisions. So when you've then got, instead of a feel of that going on in the band, when you've got that half-time feel, it creates a really nice contrast. And there I was combining it with going higher up in the range to create that kind of air between the two, and it kind of feels like the guitar's sort of floating on top of this very big solid underpinning that comes from the half-time kind of ideas. So there's a lot to be had from mirroring and from contrasting the things that are going on around you. And obviously rhythmic division most effectively and straight down the line is great for building sections. When it's big, you can add pace by playing more, and when it's quieter, you can add pace by playing less divisions. One thing I've always found useful, amazingly useful, is very easy sometimes to sort of just stop playing and play straight through, but there are so many examples where you can find a part that's just playing one chord per beat through a verse or a chorus. Sometimes that can give the effect of it being quite big, and sometimes it's quite useful when it's kind of small in dynamic to kind of just underpin those progressions and lend some kind of stability to things. You'll often hear, if you put some headphones on and listen to things in stereo and start listening for the parts, quite often there will be a guitar that's marking the changes one chord per bar. So that's always a really useful thing in kind of church stuff. So yeah, mirroring and contrasting and creating phrases by combining different subdivisions is another really effective way of getting mileage out of shapes and positions that you already have in your playing. For the third time, I hope that makes sense. And we'll do the next stage in the next video.